recording, and then I'm going to open the, where are you? Where? There we go. This was hiding from me. So today we're going to talk about, I want to talk about interviews and other methods. So this is mostly focused on interviews, but in general, what we're going to talk about is largely sort of mostly qualitative, but one quantitative method for assessing candidates. So whereas like when we talked about individual differences before, individual differences like cognitive ability, personality, and even to a lesser extent, but things like vocational interests and values can be assessed with what are sometimes called like objective psychological measures. But in this case, what we're going to be talking about are things that are less objective, and in the case of interviews, can be fully subjective. So, um, our learning objectives today, we're going to talk about several different things. Like we're going to spend most of the time on interviews, but I want people to know what we mean by what's called biodata, which is just a short term for biographical data. It's not as sophisticated as it sounds. It's not like we're doing blood tests or something like that. And similarly, I want people to know something about what are called situational judgment tests, which are increasingly popular for some classes of jobs. And then we're going to spend most of the time talking about interviews. And in particular, we're going to focus on two sort of dichotomous categories that interviews can jointly fall in, that greatly affect how well interviews do at predicting people's success on the job. So structured versus unstructured interviews, and situational versus behavioral interviews. And we're really going to try to talk a lot about, or try to focus on what we can do to make our interviews good. And so the first thing we'll talk about is biographical data. So biodata is just a term of art here. And what we're talking about are just any instruments. And this could be conducted as part of an interview. Like when we're talking about biodata, usually this is something that's going to be collected using pencil and paper. And in some ways, you can think about it as part of what biodata is doing. In fact, like a resume is sort of an unstructured qualitative biodata instrument. What people are doing when they're sending you their resume is telling you things about their background, telling you about their education, their previous job experience. Well-constructed resumes will usually tell you about what kind of projects people have worked on at those jobs, or what sort of their experiences were. And in fact, that's what we're trying to get at when we talk about biodata, is that we want to be able to have a good idea before we hire people of what their experience has been, what their accomplishments have been, what training they've had, and all of those sorts of things that we would expect to be related to performance on the job that we're interested in hiring them for. So yeah, biodata instruments can be developed in a number of ways. And these are the three main ways. And this is something that's also been applied in lots of other areas. And I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on the development here, but I want you to be able to recognize different approaches. So one of the main ones is what we call empirical keying. There's also something called factor analytic, and then there's rational or theory-based approaches. That could also be something that we could call an expert expert approach, and they can all of those approaches can be used for almost all other instruments, which could include, if we wanted to have some sort of like objective way of scoring an interview, could apply there as well. So Biodata is like one of the original approaches here was something called empirical keying, which is we would ask people a lot of questions about their background, and then usually as part of, and we'll see this when we talk about selection systems next week. We'll see a little bit more about kind of like is that next week? Anyways, yeah, I think it is. We'll see more about this approach where, so maybe we're already hiring a group of people, but we've never used biodata before. So we're using whatever our original hiring method was, whatever our selection strategy was, but we're also asking a bunch of biodata questions. So stuff about, maybe leadership positions they've held, which could include like clubs or things in school, stuff like that. We ask lots and lots of questions about that, and then we just throw it against the wall to see what sticks. And that's the basic idea. The basic idea there is we're just going to say take all of those items, and of the people we hired, we're just going to see which items have good predictive validity, which ones correlate well with maybe their 6-month performance review or 1-year annual review rating, something along those lines. And that's all. The ones that are good at predicting performance, we keep. The ones that are not as good, we get rid of. So the basic idea is, and you'll, like in general, this happens a lot with lots of different sort of measure developments. Like when we talked about personality testing a few weeks ago, similar sorts of things happen there. We basically give the applicants a long test, and we keep the relative handful of items that predict our measures of job performance well. And the big problem with this, though, is, and this should come as no surprise if you have any appreciation of statistics at all, is that some of the stuff's just going to work, right, in sample for no good reason, like what we might call, what people usually sort of naively call by chance. And it's not necessarily just chance it worked, but the basic idea is like we could have an item or 10 that wind up looking really good in the sample that we happen to validate this on, but then when we go to use them, they're crap. They don't work well at all. And so usually what the appropriate way to deal with this statistically is to do what's called a cross-validation. We're going to talk about that concept more in the context of discussing selection systems, and validation. But the basic idea with that would be that we would conduct multiple separate studies with this biodata item, and then, or biodata measure, and then we would see across these different samples which items consistently work well at predicting the outcomes that we're interested in this case, job performance. And that can protect you against this sort of like it happened by chance, because errors line up and stuff like that, but they don't tend to do that across multiple studies. There's also, as we kind of talked about briefly in the personality chapter, we can also use factor analysis to do this. So again, you start with a big test. That's what usually happens, and you see which items kind of clump together. So like they define what we sometimes call a dimension or a trait, like when we were talking about like cognitive ability or extroversion, like the kind of items that hang together there. So we might ask like questions that might work this way. Might be if we ask, a question about, have you ever held a leadership position? Have you ever been like an executive in a club or social group or something along those lines? And the basic idea there is, you'll have a bunch of items that would kind of like clump together to define sort of a leadership sort of domain, and you just keep the ones that are strongest in that, like they're the best indicators of whatever that underlying thing is. Again, the details are not hugely important, but the trouble with that is that items can hang together and they can define one of these dimensions really, really well. but they might have sort of the opposite problem to what the empirical keying does, which is when you go to like, you might put all this together and you have this like great leadership dimension or what looks like it, but it doesn't wind up predicting performance at all, or possibly anything else. Like it may not even predict leadership for that matter. Um, so with that, you tend to need, again, multiple studies where you're factor analyzing things to see which items consistently come together, but also looking to see which ones predict well. And there are ways of actually doing that simultaneously. There are techniques in statistics called like something called principal components regression and a couple of other sorts of things like this where you can kind of do these things simultaneously. But overall, this is probably like I think in the literature and the work that's been done on validating these kinds of measures, empirical keying is definitely more prominent than this one. People care more because again, this is primarily a tool for selecting people. Like it doesn't matter if we have good, clear dimensions in it. I mean, that matters to maybe people like me who are essentially psychological researchers. But in practice, like for you, like if you're going out to be a practitioner and you want to develop biodata measures, it doesn't matter that they are conceptually clear. What matters is that whether or not they work. And by doing good work on the empirical keying, you will have measures that work. They will predict performance. The last approach is what's sometimes called rational or theory-based. And the basic idea here is we're just going to put this together based on expert judgments. And the experts could be subject matter experts. So like these are not necessarily like people like professors or even executives or stuff like that. Like I used to work as an internal consultant for the state of Illinois in the US. Um, I am from the US, if I haven't mentioned that before. So I've also been distracted this week by that election thing. But anyways, working there, we used a group of pipe fitters as our experts on items like this that were relevant to being a pipe fitter. Right. Again, not people. These are not people with like a ton of formal education. Um, they're good. I mean, they're good at what they do. They were professionals about it and stuff like that. So again, when we say expert here, what we mean is somebody who knows the job and the kinds of people who are good at the job. And so they try to, and so you consult with your experts to try to write good items, and then you use their expertise to try to pick the items that will work the best. Now there is the problem that even experts experts make mistakes all the time, so they can come up with judgments about this that are just way off. Now, that's a possibility. In general, it doesn't happen a lot in these domains, particularly with if you're trying to select people for very concrete jobs, like the example I was using there with like pipe fitters or plumbers or something like that. They tend to do a really good job, especially those kinds of like trades jobs. The experts are great at helping you to design this because most of those sorts of trades have like carefully constructed codes in terms of like what and knowledge bases and apprenticeship or journeyman programs and things like that. And so like when you talk to people who are doing that sort of concrete thing, then they usually have incredibly good advice about what you need to do. Whereas sometimes with more professional jobs, even though maybe our experts there are highly educated, very, very literate, and all of those sorts of things, just the job can be more confused, like more amorphous, harder to pin down, and therefore their expert judgments about like what kind of background is important are not always great. Like for instance, especially if you're working with executives or something along those lines. You can run into the situation where they're heavily biased by what we would call survivorship bias. Like most people who go into business do not become executives. The ones who do are successful. They didn't attrit out of the process, and so they tend to think about their own experiences and what made them successful and maybe overgeneralize. Without people who sort of fell out before they became executives, you don't know. Like there could be, like for everybody who says, I was in my high school's agriculture club and that's why I'm great at being an executive, there could be 100 other people who were not successful who had exactly the same background. And so that's something to be aware of when you're working with experts, particularly professionals, that that survivorship bias really does come into play. Um, and the other thing about this is that in general, you can hybridize these. So whether you might use empirical keying for developing your any kind of scoring system that you're going to use here, but you might get the items from these experts. Could you have? I mean, I've been involved in that process as a project that a lab that I was a part of was working on for the U.S. For the well to privatize and commercialize a product that we had produced for the U.S. Army. We needed to each write, maybe each person had to write like maybe 10 items for the product, and that was pretty like for each person to do that was pretty easy. So if you have like a bunch of if you have 10 experts and each one of them writes you 10 items, you pretty quickly have like a 100 item scale that you could submit to your empirical keying or your factor analytic approach. And so it's really, so again, making use of subject matter experts to help you to write at least the first draft of items. Like maybe the items need, like before you submit them, they need revision, they need editing, and those sorts of things. But there you go. Oh, yeah, well, that's the thing. So I just got a question asking which approach is best at predicting performance, and so it's in general, like at the first level where you're developing it, the empirical keying is going to give you the best predictive validity, because that's what you're using it for. But surprisingly, rational approaches can work just as well. The factor analytic approaches can work surprisingly well. The one thing, and this is something that like since I mentioned cross-validation, will come up again like in a week or two in the discussion about selection systems. If you're using empirical keying, the one thing to realize is and this is related to the argument that I was just talking about in terms of you can by chance have some items that look great that don't work the next time, for instance. That's why you need cross-validation. One thing to bear in mind is when you do empirical keying, let's say you like whatever measure you develop out of it, you get a correlation with performance in sample that's here. The next one is essentially always going to be lower, and this is just regression to the mean. The basic idea is those items that you selected, even with cross-validation, are going to be the ones that did the best in that study that you conducted to validate this. And that means that they're going to be the ones that have the best positive error, the ones that are the error that makes those items the best. And so whenever you go to use it, you have to expect some shrinkage in validity. But again, in general, because you are building it exclusively to predict performance, the empirical key is usually is probably your, I don't want to say it's always the best, but it's probably your best bet for doing it. Not necessarily. Depending on the experts, uh, whether or not, sorry, the chat was asking whether rational would be better for contextual performance and the others would be better for task, and it's possible. Especially if I mean the thing about rational approaches are that the you can kind of think about it as, well, if you've ever had experience either being in or conducting a focus group, you can the way or any kind of like a group interview experience, you could help craft, like when you're dealing with experts, whether it's subject matter or otherwise, you can help point them in different directions. So if you're giving them instructions that help to focus on contextual performance, by giving them stems about what you mean, like you could have them, you could ask them questions about like what kind of backgrounds do your best team players have, and things like that. So you using experts, you could get maybe grounded, realistic items that are likely to predict contextual performance. But there's no reason, like, but again, um, I mean, you as the HR professional could write those items as well. It's just that yours may be less grounded in the everyday lived experience of that job, whereas your subject matter experts probably have a good idea of what contextual performance is like in that job and what kind of people do it. Again, not necessarily without any kind of bias, but so you can do that. Cool. All right. And so just to
Right.
look at, oh, yes.
Where would professional designation fall under? I guess it would just be theory based. Like if someone has a nursing license or a
Oh, well,
doctor
see, I think
or.
in general, that's probably more the sort of thing. Like I said that, I said that resumes are sort of like unstructured biodata items, and so like yeah, if you have relevant licensures or certificates, um, in general, that would typically, for the kinds of jobs where those exist, they're probably actually likely to, if you think back several weeks now, those are the kinds of things that are probably going to fall under minimum qualifications or minimum requirements.
Okay.
And so it would probably be the kind of thing where, and this just as a preview of when we're going to talk about selection systems, in general, a lot of times what we're talking about here, whether it's interviews or whatever, are going to probably be like a later state. Like a lot of times what people are going to use is a selection system that has stages, right? And so your interview or your resume is sort of, a lot of times it's, I mean, especially big organizations that get lots of applicants, it's going to be like basically a scanning for keywords. It's going to be like, okay, licensed in whatever, or certified, like whether it's nursing licensure or like having your professional engineering certificate or whatever those sorts of things is. You're going to look through it and just be like, okay, and people who have the right qualifications go into the next pile, and people who don't are just gone. So that's where I think those things would typically fall. But if there are additional requirements that are not necessary for doing the job, but that your experts are telling you are important to know and worthwhile, then yeah, it would generally fall here, like in terms of the rational approach, in that somebody who knows something about the job has to say, oh, this is not absolutely necessary, but it seems like everybody who does a good job has it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And again, the other thing that I want to just take a moment there to illustrate, and this is going to come be true when we're talking about interviews and situational judgment tests as well, is that these are like not fully independent methods, right? Like I said, you can use these sort of rational or theory-based approaches to generate items and then score and then attempt to pick items that work well or topics that work well using empirical or factor analytic approaches. So it doesn't, I mean, you don't have to say, like, I'm going with this and only this. In terms of evidence, we're going to see here that, like, biodata, this is this is one of the oldest meta-analyses, and there's been a lot of research on biodata. Like biodata, it was a pretty huge uh, research domain in like the mid to late aughts or knots or whatever we're calling the first decade of the 2000s. So that, like, these have improved somewhat, but these numbers are still probably the best that we have, which is that, you know, job like biodata is probably better than personality at predicting job performance, but not as good as cognitive ability measures. So with job performance, you know, like, and that's quasi-objectively measured job performance, a correlation of in the mid-0.3s. Supervisory rating specifically a little bit higher. People's chance at promotion a little bit lower, and their success in training exactly 0.3. The trouble is, like, those older measures, a lot of the useful variance was basically eaten up by cognitive ability, because, like, you had people with higher cognitive ability were taking on more roles, had more experience, more, like, higher grades, more certifications, those sorts of things. There's still, in general, there's biodata is potentially, um, depending on what you're assessing with it, there is strong, like, in places like where there are systematic disparities in terms of educational opportunities, and those sorts of things between racial, ethnic groups, men and women, any sort of protected status, then biodata items have the potential to just reflect those sort of social and cultural things. So we don't know a ton about group differences in biodata. By group differences, I mean, you know, like with cognitive ability, we briefly talked about, like, the um, the quote unquote race gap. But again, like with biodata, since biodata is really focused on people's objective experiences, if there are if there's like systematic discrimination, or other sorts of, like, structural differences in access to those experiences between groups, biodata is just all it's going to do with those sorts of things is just, like, freeze those into that form. So for a long time, these weren't even used very much, so we didn't know a lot. Like I said, we've learned quite a bit. One big thing that I think is worth mentioning here, is sort of like, um, well, like personality tests and like interviews, as we'll see here, people with biodata, like, if we just ask, have you ever had any leadership experiences? People could just say yes, right? They could just lie about it. And one of probably the most interesting piece of research, from the last decade or so on this shows people will lie on biodata items, but if you ask them to elaborate, even if you don't do anything with the elaborations, but basically you ask them a question like, have you ever had a leadership experience? And then you just have a follow-up question where they just have to write a small snippet about what that leadership experience was. People tend to provide much more honest answers, because especially, like, if there's a time limit and things like that, people just do not typically have the cognitive span to make up stories about all of these biodata items. So if you would just ask, like, brief elaborating questions where people just have to write in or type in a little narrative about what the experience is that they're saying yes to. It tends to improve the validity. And so that's something that people first started studying around, well, first started publishing on in like around like 2007, 2008. So, you know, when we're looking at validity now, it's can be like if people use really well developed biodata measures, it can be better than these numbers are. Um, but again, people don't use it a ton, or at least they don't use it systematically a ton. Like I said, people do like different organizations that aren't just sort of going through resumes for keywords. They do some organizations do resume scoring, which is basically a biodata approach, but they don't necessarily do it systematically in a way that they're collecting validity evidence on. Basically, they're just trying to find like the person, like the people who are the best without really using it in a systematic way. And that's something that's going to come up again and again in talking about this, is that organizations do not use the information they're collecting about potential about their applicants systematically. The next thing is a similar tool to biodata, but biodata is about your actual concrete past, where situational judgment tests are sort of hypothetical, but there are things that that are um, designed to measure reasoning and decision making in a way that's much more embedded in particular contexts than typical cognitive ability tests. Like, whereas a cognitive ability test, like the Wonder like personnel test, might ask you to sort of like rotate some unusual shaped object in your head in 3 dimensions. Um, which is a good indication of people's spatial ability. But what situational judgment tests are trying to do are to get at things like this, like what's sometimes called tacit or practical knowledge. Tacit in the sense that you can know how to do something, but find it very difficult to explain to someone else how to do it. And this is something that happens a lot with professionals with lots of experience who are suddenly called upon to teach others, to mentor or teach. So it's, I know how to do something. Like, I mean, this experience, like I have my kids are twins. They're clones of one another, like they're identical twins. Whereas like when I was teaching one of them to ride a bike without training wheels, basically I just kind of gave her a push and she went off. And so I didn't have to do anything. It was just sort of like helping her figure out how to stop and like stuff like that. But it was very easy. My other daughter had a lot is well has been having a lot more trouble doing it. And then I've been riding a bike for 35 years. I don't think about it very much, trying to figure out how to talk to and demonstrate to someone just learning it. How to do that is what tacit knowledge is. So, like, for probably most of you, anybody who knows how to ride a bicycle, it is probably a piece of tacit knowledge. You just know how to do it. But if you had to, you would have to stop and think hard about how to, you probably have to like take time to think about how you can even talk about doing it. Like people always say, you know, it's like riding a bicycle, someone to describe something as being simple, whereas like it's not simple when you're learning how to do it. So that's what we mean by tacit, is it's something that's become like essentially become quote unquote second nature. Also, situational judgment tests, people try to use them to assess what's sometimes called social competence or emotional intelligence, or more broadly, social skills. So things that are not quite cognitive ability, are not quite personality, but are something about how skillfully people handle social situations. Like if you have to deal with, like, say you're a manager who one of your subordinates is dealing with a difficult customer who's becoming agitated and potentially, and there may be some kind of, like, there may be an altercation. That's what we're trying to deal with. Like, you as a manager, how do you intervene? How do you handle that? How do you get that? How do you make sure that this is safe and that that client, like, how do you de-escalate the situation, for instance? And that's the kind of thing that that's like an extreme example, but it's the kind of thing that we're talking about with social competence and emotional intelligence, is how do you engage with people who are having maybe both appropriate and inappropriate emotions. Same thing with conflict management skills and leadership. These sorts of complex domains that if you put someone in a situation, I think the thing about situational judgment tests is they're it's the kind of thing where we're trying to assess how well a person functions in the kinds of situations where there might be multiple right answers and there might be a lot of different kinds of approaches that are quote unquote wrong, but basically that there are approaches, like there might be one to or five or however many like ways of having like an acceptable outcome, and there might be a bunch of ways of having unacceptable outcomes. And that's why we're talking about these more complex things like leadership, conflict management, social skills, tacit knowledge. um, these can be done with quote unquote pencil and paper. And by that could also be just the kind of like online sort of survey type thing that we've seen, that probably most of you probably internet quizzes or things like that could be done that way. But they're really start to get special when you start to combine these with like audio video material, semi-interactive material. Like at one point, in the 2000s, the FBI in the United States was using something like this, where a cadet, a trainee, an FBI trainee, would be interacting with, like, in a virtual environment, they would be interviewing a material witness for like a terrorism case or something like that. And so they're interacting like by like as if they're actually talking to this person who's providing responses. Like it's a fully computerized system providing responses, and there's even like a little trainer agent monitoring the situation in the like who's a computerized agent as well, just who's kind of like providing feedback, like, and stuff like that. So I mean, you can do really interesting things with this. And then the basic idea here is you're presenting a relatively complex situation. So something like you're a manager and you're dealing with two of your subordinates have a conflict. And so like your approach, maybe you have to figure out, is it interpersonal or is it something about work? How do you deal with it, and all of those sorts of things. An example is you have multiple options that have been proposed by your team, and you have to decide between those options. And the base thing is that usually, and again, these can be done in a more sophisticated way, but these are typically still multiple choice kinds of things. Like we might provide the person being assessed with 4, 5, 6 options, something along those lines, and just they pick whichever decision that they think that they would make in that situation. And the same sort of thing is this can be done with a form of empirical key. So you can give it to experts and complete noobs, right? Just novices who don't know what's going on with the domain you're talking about. So again, you might have this with like if we're trying to assess leadership, we have a sample of like maybe 20 leaders with a minimum of say 10 years of experience in a leadership role, versus university students as our novices who have had no professional leadership roles. And we can do this in a couple of different ways. One way, we can just see which options do the experts pick and which options do the novices pick. And sometimes they're going to be the same, and then you have a pretty objectively good answer. And when they differ, it's you usually think the one that the experts picked is the best option. The one the novices picked is certainly not a good option. It may not be the worst option, but maybe not the best. And I worked on a version of this once upon a time where we had our experts just rank these. It's like, this is the best option, second best, third best, fourth. Well, a fourth was the worst in that case. But you could also do this with the same sort of way we talked about with the biodata, where you just have, say, a performance measure and which option for each item correlates best with the outcome. So like people who chose mediating the conflict between the subordinates had the best performance. Boom. Again, same thing, you can use rational or theoretical keying, which is kind of like what we said with actually that's probably a better example, using the experts to rank order the options. So you see if the experts have a consensus on best options and a consensus on worst options, then you have a pretty good idea. I think the example that I was mentioning that I worked on, we gave the consensus best option a +1, the consensus worst option a -1, and the other two were 0. That's actually pretty much, sorry, that's the expert rating approach as well. But with theoretical keying, there's also the option with something like, my graduate advisor and his lab had years ago, like back in the 1990s, developed a leadership leadership situational judgment test, and all it was to do was to try to say, like, what was your preferred, out of 4 options, what was your preferred leadership style based on the decisions that you made, from like an autocratic leadership style on the one hand to a democratic leadership style on the other. And in that case, like, the options were chosen, each one of them was like, this is the kind of decision that an autocratic leader would make, this is the kind of decision that a consensus leader would make, this is the kind of option that a delegating leader would make, this is the kind of option that, or decision that democratic leader would make. And that was based entirely on, if you're familiar, if you remember from, say, OB, that's based entirely on the Room, Yeton, Jago model of leadership, which is all about like which decision-making approach is appropriate. So that's entirely theoretical. That's based completely on the theory, that particular theory of leadership. And again, like always, you can always combine this. So we could have, like, for instance, you could have a theoretical key in that, like, in terms of leadership style, and you could see which leadership style predicts performance the best, for instance. A-OK. And here's just one example. A man on a very urgent mission during battle finds he must cross a stream about 40 feet wide. A blizzard has been blowing and the stream has frozen over. However, because of the snow, he does not know how thick the ice is. He sees 2 planks about 10 feet long near the point where he wishes to cross. He knows there is a bridge about 2 miles downstream. Under the circumstances, he should walk to the bridge and cross it, run rapidly across the ice, break a hole in the ice near the edge of the stream and to see how deep it is, cross with the aid of the planks, pushing one ahead of the other and walking on them, or creep slowly across the ice. Right. And so with this case, the example is we're just trying to say, like, which of those 5 options is the best, or in fact, in terms of how we would present this to a potential employee, an applicant, we're asking them, which decision would you make? And depending on what we're trying to score with this, we might have different approaches. So for instance, like, for someone who is cautious but realistic, maybe D is the answer that they would choose, or sorry, C is the answer they would choose, because they are testing the stream to see how deep it is. I used to think that running rapidly across the ice was a terrible idea, but then I learned that you can run across, like if you move very quickly, you can run across a covered pool, like a pool that's got a winter cover on it. So maybe it's not so bad. But again, it all, like, this is to show you how, um, or to give an idea of how these different sort of approaches would work. Like we could have experts who are like we could get like people who are experienced in cold weather combat conditions from the armed forces to rank these options here or something along those lines. Or we could just have any kind, whatever kind of performance measure that we're interested in. Because again, this doesn't necessarily have to be this doesn't have to be a hugely face valid question. It doesn't have to be about like it doesn't have to be to select someone for like special operations or something along those lines. It could just be about testing a person's judgment. But now to get to the thing that we're really here for this week is to talk about interviews. And I think I've mentioned it in this class before. I know I've certainly mentioned it to some members of this class in response to questions that they've had, is that in general, across the world, the most common selection system used is a combination of resume review and then an interview of some form. Um, and here we just want to talk a little bit about like the different sort of types of interviews, and these are not fully independent of one another, but like one of the basic distinctions in interviews is whether or not an interview is structured or unstructured. So like the main thing with structured interview is that all candidates get the same questions. So if you're bringing in 3 people, 5 people, 10 people for an interview, you have a list of questions that you're going to ask every single candidate. And that way their interview performance is comparable in some sense. Unstructured is there's no guaranteed consistency in questions over the interviewees. It's essentially at the discretion of the interviewer. Now, the other distinction, and this is even less mutually exclusive, because the other thing to keep in mind is when we're talking about structure, those are sort of like the end caps. Like in like a fully structured interview, everybody gets exactly the same questions. In a fully unstructured interview, it's just a free for all. Like whatever happens, happens. Um, Something that happens a lot in clinical settings is something called a semi-structured interview, where there's a basic set of questions that everyone is asked, but then based on their responses, the interviewers ask different follow-up questions. So again, that's more of a continuum, even though we're presenting it as a dichotomy. So with a behavioral interview, structured behavioral and situational interviews are both structured interviews. So yeah, there's a chat here. Um, it's a very good. Just the question that was just asked is asked to me is if it's the same job, why would he ask different questions? And again, the issue here is that there isn't a set of questions in a fully unstructured interview. So if one person is conducting all of the interviews, then there may be consistency just because exactly that. Like, why would I ask different questions? But if there are going to be different interviewers, like let's say there are maybe 2 hiring managers, and one of them is able to meet with 2 candidates and another one is able to meet with 3 candidates, they may both ask the same, like their candidates, all the same questions, but if they're not coordinating, they may not ask the same questions between the 2 of them, between the 2 hiring managers. There's also the possibility that just in general, people think that they're more consistent than they are. So if you don't go into an interview with a plan, it easily becomes a conversation. And people can get derailed by the dumbest things. Like, finding out that you both went to the same university, or that you both like the same sports team or fast food restaurant, or just dumb things. Like that's something that will become more and more apparent later on, is that people get distracted by dumb stuff. And so usually what we want to try to do is to minimize the points at which that dumb stuff is able to distract people. Um, I get distracted by dumb stuff all the time. All the time. So I'm not saying I'm above this, but that's why we tend to have, like, we try to have rules and structures and policies and procedures in place to help prevent that from happening. So, and again, that's the thing, is like with an unstructured interview, there's just no guarantee that there is consistency. Whereas with a structured interview, you have guaranteed consistency. So the main difference between behavioral and situational, though, is they're both structured interviews. Behavioral interviews ask you about specific experiences that you have already had. So, like an example of a behavioral interview is, describe a time when you had to deal with a hostile customer and how you dealt with it. Whereas a situational interview is similar to a situational judgment test. It's giving you a hypothetical or potential experience and asking how you would deal with it. Now, again, for people who have the previous experience, they're probably drawing on the previous experience when they answer the hypothetical. But for entry-level jobs, people new to the workforce, they only have their hypothetical responses. So like here, the same situation, just a different way of asking it is basically, imagine an angry customer has come in complaining about his or her order. How do you deal with this customer? So again, behavioral is asking you to think about actual experiences that you've had and to talk about them. Situational is saying, what would you do if this happened? Now, in terms of interviews, in terms of the content of interviews, we want to make sure, like when you're building an interview plan, you want to make sure that it's based on the job analysis, right? So we want to make sure that we're asking about experiences that our subject matter experts, our incumbents, have said are important, that we're asking about certifications, skills, knowledge, those sorts of things that are relevant to the job. We want to ask about past experiences in related jobs or with similar sorts of performance situations. So we want to make sure that our interview questions are grounded in a job analysis. Now, that doesn't mean like that the job analysis is telling us which questions to ask. It's just that our questions are designed using the job analysis as a sort of blueprint, because it's telling us what the job is, and that's telling us what kinds of questions are appropriate. We want to, like, structure an interview, we want to make sure that all candidates are asked the same questions. We also want to make sure that we have relatively limited prompting, follow-up, and elaboration by the interviewer. And this can be really hard. And this is one place where like a lack of structure can creep in. Let's just say you're talking to someone who is relatively unresponsive. So whereas like maybe like you might say something like, have you ever had a leadership experience? And one person might say, oh yeah, I was in fact, I'll use a true example from my experience, which will set the tone for just what a nerd I am. I was the founding vice president of my high school's astronomy club, and and I wrote our charter. Um, but anyways, like, whereas like somebody else would just, like another person, you might say, have you ever had any leadership experiences? And that person would be like, yes. So the interviewer is then put in this position, like, it's easy enough, like if somebody just answers with one word to a complicated question that expects or prompts more detail, that the interviewer would be like, oh, what was that experience? Or something along that's prompting follow-up or elaboration. And that's fine. Like a good interviewer should be doing some of that. But if we want to make sure that our interviews are comparable and that we're assessing the person and not the interviewer, we want to make sure that those are limited. We want to make sure that our questions are focusing on past job experiences, work relevant background. So that could be education, it could be skills, it could be hobbies that are relevant to that. Like, you know, I mean, just let's say I'm hiring fishermen. If somebody fishes as a hobby, that's relevant. That is work relevant background. But and job specific knowledge, all of those things are totally fair game. But basically, you know, like when we're talking about basically focusing on like what kinds of experiences do you have that are relevant, what do you know that is relevant, how can you contribute to this organization. You also want to like strictly control the interview length. Like you want to make sure that everybody has an hour and no more, right? You want to control the data that's given to the interviewer. So like for instance, we may want to sanitize, like whereas like the easiest thing to do is to give your interviewer a copy of the person's resume. But because people prepare their own resumes, they differ considerably from one another. So what we might do instead is, whereas like, you know, if somebody has just a much better looking resume, like maybe a more or a less experienced, less capable person just has put a lot of time into the resume. So the resume looks great versus somebody who's extremely capable, but as a result has a relatively plain looking resume. That could bias the interviewer. So sometimes it's better to do things where, like, as an HR professional, we have extracted the common information from the resumes, put them into a common format, and then give that data sheet to the interviewer as opposed to just a copy of the resume, because the resume could contain all kinds of formatting details, unnecessary information, stuff like that that could bias the interviewer. Um, Similarly, we want to control the timing of the interviewee questions. Like if you've ever been on an interview, you know there's always at some point in the interview, do you have any questions for us? And we want to make sure that though we maybe have set instructions to tell the interviewees to hold their questions about the organization and the job until the end, or we ask them if they have any questions specifically beforehand. We want to make sure that like we have set it up so that the interviewer is in control during the interview itself, and so that they're limiting those sorts of questions from the interviewer or interviewee. So like it might be, that's an important question. We'll come back to that at the end of the interview. Something along those lines. It can be very simple, very polite in that sort of sense. And the interview process, this is complicated, and this is part that doesn't go into that people don't often do. So a lot of time, I'd say a lot of times interviews are rated purely subjectively. Like it's just basically, you know, the interviewer will sit down afterwards and be like, that was a good interview, that was a bad interview, all of those sorts of things, and just try to be like, think about like out of the people, even, and if there's multiple interviewers, this might be a group meeting or something along those lines. Just talking about like what was good, what was bad, and those sorts of things. Whereas the alternative, if we want to be highly structured, is we want to like right after the interview have the interviewer rate the interview on some kind of a consistent approach. Like we could, like they could be even during the interview rating the interviewee's response to each question. They could just rate the overall interview. They could provide an overall rating, like just like a single quality of interview scale. Or they could have multiple rating scales in terms of like maybe person's preparedness, relevant previous job experience, knowledge, like job relevant knowledge. Like you could be rating all of those things. We could anchor the rating scales, we could do that in the same kind of ways that, although I kind of skipped over it pretty quickly, but like when we were talking about performance appraisal, this is all in the slides, like we could provide anchors for it, which could be just simply like, you know, unacceptable to outstanding, or it could be anchored like with particular behaviors or something along those lines. One key thing, and this is true, like, when we talked about performance appraisal, I mentioned this is particularly true with interviews, is the interviewer should take good notes. You want to be able to, especially if you're going to wind up, you want those notes to help you if you're going to rate the interview, to rate it. But if you're just going to have a conversation with, the other decision makers responsible for hiring someone, you want to have notes so that you can answer any questions about a particular interviewee with confidence and with facts about the interview. It can be also, like, depending on the circumstances, if you get the permission from the interviewees, recording the interview can be totally appropriate. You also need to make some decisions. Like, in general, I think most interviews are done one-on-one. So there's one interviewer, one interviewee. For instance, here, and I'll speak with some confidence of this because, as I may have mentioned at the beginning of this class, this is actually, when I got this job, this was the third time I'd interviewed at the John Nicholson School of Business. I'd come in second, third, and then finally first in those interviews. And one thing that's unique about the experience here, or at least that I found unique, was that the job process, or the interview process, starts off with a group essentially a reverse panel interview. So you have the entire hiring committee seated around a conference table. They come in and sit in the hot seat. That's like, I think part of the reason that I did poorly the first few times was, for me, this was an entry-level job, and I just was unprepared for that level of intimidation. And that's something to bear in mind. Like, if you're hiring entry level, that can be overwhelming. Whereas if you're hiring seasoned professionals, maybe a panel interview so that everybody who's in on making the decision has equivalent experience of the interviewee could be good. So those are, like, again, there's no one right way here. The idea is just to give some idea of what's going on. The one thing that is absolutely should be done is training interviewers. So, like, what you want to make sure is, like, this is kind of like what we talked about briefly with rating biases and performance review. Like, we want to make sure that, like, anybody who interviews for a particular job the interviewer shouldn't matter. And that's one of the nice things about structured interviews is we have a set procedure, we have set questions. We train the interviewers on the questions and the procedure, slot them down, any ratings that are going to be done, train them about that. So I should be able to plop any one of the potential interviewers into any interview and get comparable results. Maybe not exactly the same, but comparable. Like, it should be a process that is reliable between interviewers. Now, the interesting thing about interviews is that they vary widely in how valid they are, like in terms of how well they predict job performance. So highly structured interviews have pretty darn good predictive validity. They actually predict slightly better than cognitive ability does. But even the least structured interviews are still predicting job performance about on the level of conscientiousness, right? So they're still tapping something. Situational interviews tend to have pretty good validity. So again, remember, situational interviews are structured interviews that are asking hypothetical questions. Job-related, like ensuring that all questions, not necessarily like structuring them, but all questions asked are fundamentally job-related, i.e. based in the job analysis, still gives you pretty good validity. And again, it's important to realize, like what I said, is almost all organizations use some form of interview as part of their selection process. But the most popular approach, which is unstructured and non-behavioral, is also the least valid. Not to say it's invalid, but it is the least valid. So, and that's what happens a lot is companies just bring people in, sit them down. This is, in fact, it's starting to be true in tech because people have like in high tech companies traditionally for the last couple of decades or so, the tech interview was a highly structured environment where people would be asked various difficult sorts of logic questions and probably have to write some pseudocode on a whiteboard. But even those are becoming less popular now, and so those tend to be highly structured. Even in tech companies, we're starting to move towards more unstructured sorts of things. And I mean, there may be reasons for it, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about validity evidence, well, validity in general, over the next couple of weeks. But I'll give the preview that the less structured and documented your process is, you may get sued as an organization, but people are going to have a hard time proving anything because there's no there. That's the cynical approach, but there is some evidence that things have moved to a less structured, less scientific, and less valid approach through fears of litigation. And more unstructured, there's some not super strong evidence, but as you can see, even see it here, our most structured are behavioral interviews, which have slightly but notably higher validity than the situational interviews. But so behavioral, so past-oriented interviews may have at least somewhat more predictive validity, like so they do a better job of forecasting who's going to be good at the job than situational interviews. But that's weak. Like both, like as long as like the real takeaway here is that structure is the most important thing. Like the more structured your interview is, as long as you're keeping the content job related, the more valid it will be. But even the least structured interviews provide incremental validity over cognitive ability. So like we could give people a cognitive ability test and an interview. The interview is telling us something that isn't cognitive ability. The one thing to keep in mind about behavioral interviews is that it may be difficult to write good behavioral interview questions for inexperienced job applicants. So people like, again, as I mentioned several times here, entry-level jobs, people may have no relevant job experience and therefore like they don't have past experiences to talk about in any detail. Therefore, situational interview questions may be better under those circumstances. Or at least they may be more fair in some sense to those entry-level applicants. The other thing to keep in mind about is what are we actually getting a hold of with interviews? So to some extent, whether we're talking about structured or unstructured interviews, where what we're getting is some combination of cognitive ability, job experience, job knowledge, personality, social skills, and judgment. So you're kind of like, the thing is like interviews are great because they're very rich. Like most qualitative things, they're extremely rich. Like if I give you a cognitive ability test and a personality test, that's it. That's all I've got. Whereas if I give you an interview that's designed to measure those, I'm also getting at least some of these other things. Structured interviews seem to be better at they're like what the constructs, the variables about people, the characteristics that they're assessing seem to be very much job experience and knowledge and social skills. So, and that's partially why structured interviews really do have incremental validity over cognitive ability, because cognitive ability and social skills have very little to do with one another. There are smart people who are very socially skilled, smart people who are very socially unskilled, dumb people who are socially skilled, and dumb people who are not socially skilled. So, and I'm essentializing when I say smart and dumb there, so don't overthink that. Like that doesn't necessarily mean really anything. What I mean there is just people who do well at cognitive ability tests versus don't do well at cognitive ability tests. Unstructured interviews, on the other hand, you get a big dose of cognitive ability. So if you're not measuring it, an unstructured interview is giving you what's a proxy? It's not a good measure of cognitive ability, but it is getting a person's responses in an interview are highly shaped by like how capable they are cognitively. And you also tend to get a lot of personality, but the parts that tend to be pretty weakly related to performance. So like agreeableness comes through in an interview. Like a person who's highly agreeable, usually like it's going to be nice to talk to them. They're pleasant to be around. They give you the impression that they're going to try to help you out. But also openness. Like people who are open tend to be interested in talking about experiences and those sorts of things. So so you get, again, even unstructured interviews are tapping real individual differences. They're tapping real characteristics of people. Just they're they're not necessarily doing it as well as something that's designed to do those things, and some of what you're getting does not have a lot of bang for its buck. And that's the thing is, like, just in general, I want to be clear, like the methods we've talked about today are just that, they're methods. So situational judgment tests, biodata, interviews are all just methods. And so you can use them, as we saw here talking about the construct, you can use them to assess cognitive ability, we can use them to assess personality, use them to assess specific skills, background experience, knowledge, all of those sorts of things. So the thing, like, whereas it's easy to just kind of look at something like an interview and say, this is about social skills, but it doesn't have to be. Social skills are probably going to be a relevant part of any interview experience, but you can design an interview, like I said, like technical interviews in the tech sector have traditionally been basically extremely specific and elaborate cognitive ability tests. Uh, and arguably job knowledge as well, but in the same domain as the cognitive ability test. So again, they're interviews in that they're face to face, typically one on one or small groups, but they are not synonymous with a particular thing. Like I'm not like when I give you like when we do an interview, I'm not just assessing interviewness. That's really everything about this. We'll probably, I mean, issues here will continue to come up as we talk about selection systems, because again, we'll talk about how we can put together different things. Like I've already illustrated that the most common selection system in the world is a resume and an interview. So I got a question, and I'll just read the question because it's a long one, and it's actually a pretty good one. Do employees in HR get trained on how to read people, like body language, to see if the person's telling the truth during the interview? If yes, is that a good idea or not? And I'd say there are trainings available for these sorts of things, but in general, there is one training that has a lot of scientific evidence for it that falls in this domain, and this is there's a very well-known psychologist named Paul Ekman, well-known enough to, there was a TV series maybe about a decade ago called Lie to Me that was based loosely on his work. And he has training programs on how to read what they call facial microexpressions. So the idea behind a microexpression is, like, for instance, let me see if I can do a good face. Well, we'll just do a basic expression, right? So this is me happy. This is me sad. This is me disgusted. And the idea here is that those are full-on expressions. The idea behind a micro-expression is that when someone experiences a feeling, they can't automatically hide that typically. So you experience the emotion, your face makes the expression, but if you're trying to be deceptive or acting or something along those lines, you cover it up quickly. So these might last, a fraction of a second. And what the training there is to do is to try to teach people how to recognize the micro expressions. And it appears the training works for recognizing micro expressions. Now the claim is that therefore you can tell when people are experiencing an emotion other than what they're like verbally presenting, which may or may not be lying. There's a lot less evidence that that's the case. And in terms of reading body, there's lots and lots of stories. There's lots of people who claim to know things about this, like former hostage negotiators and FBI and CIA interrogators and all of these people selling things on reading body language and those sorts of things. The one thing that seems to be consistent is that there are no consistent behavioral cues that a person is lying. Now, that's not to say that individuals, like in poker, people are supposed, like if they're bluffing, some people have tells. Not everybody has a tell, all of those sorts of things. But the basic idea is like there's not something consistent. Like you probably like, what is it? I think like there's like what is essentially an old wives' tale that when people are lying, they look up and to the left. I think the story is absolutely no evidence that that's true. So body people use their bodies to communicate a lot. So body language, body like nonverbal communication is a very important thing. And there is a lot of research on how people use their bodies as part of their communication. I'm doing it right now, right? The way I'm moving my hands, even though you can barely see my hands on Zoom, I'm using it to emphasize things, to draw attention in particular ways, to give the impression of dynamism and things moving. So people do that. So there is such a thing as body language in the sense that nonverbal communication is extremely important. We use it a lot. Like it's much harder. It's much more cognitively demanding to listen to, understand, and interpret someone when you do not have visual access to their nonverbal communication. So I don't want to downplay this, but there's not a consistent there's not a consistent body language, or at least there's relatively little evidence for that. Like people always talk about this crossing your arms as being a defensive gesture. There's I'm not saying that's false, but I am saying there's relatively little evidence that it's true. So that this is all a detailed way of saying that no, that various organizations probably do various trainings for people, but that I would be skeptical of every one of those trainings unless they were able to provide lots of information about how valid the training is. Like I said, the Ekman stuff, on the facial microexpressions, it is like they have plenty of evidence that people are better at recognizing microexpressions after the training. But they do not have a ton of evidence that being good at recognizing microexpressions does much for any of this. I mean, yes, I would say you will be able to read people better if you know that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to tell whether they're telling the truth or not. In general, like the one thing based on research that some cognitive psychologists have done is if you suspect that someone is lying about something, to try to get them to tell the story, the narrative of whatever you think they're lying about, out of order. Because if a person has actually experienced the thing that they're talking about, it's not difficult for them to sort of tell you the story backwards, or like from the middle to the end and then how they got to that middle. So it's relatively easy then, whereas people will stutter, they will take longer, they will stop to think on average if they're lying. Not to say that, I mean, some people are very skilled liars. So I don't want to say that that's a universal either, but that does seem to be a relatively consistent way, is to try to get people to basically, you want to, if someone has practiced a lie, they have a script and they can go through that script. So if you break the script, then they'll have to do more cognitive work in order to continue to tell the lie. And you may be able to detect the additional work that they're doing. But even things like polygraph tests, so-called lie detectors, they don't detect lies. All they do is detect physiological arousal. And so people can lie without any obvious physiological arousal signs. People can become physiologically aroused, like the heartbeat goes up, galvanic skin response, just because they're stressed, because you have them hooked up to a machine to detect whether they're lying or not. And that's why those have never, I'm not sure what the standards for evidence in Canadian courts are, but for scientific evidence in courts in the United States, it's called the Daubert standards, and the quote unquote lie detectors, polygraphs, have never passed that. So they are, I mean, they're used a lot, like for secure positions, like if you want to become like an FBI agent or a CIA agent or something like that in the United States, they use a polygraph test as part of the screening, like this part of the security screening. But those are not, I'm not aware of any country in the Anglosphere, at least, where polygraphs are admissible as court, like admissible as evidence in court, for instance. And so, like, I would say that at the level of legality, there is no method of detecting lies that is valid and reliable enough to meet those standards. So long answer to a basic question. And that's about it. I'm gonna have to pop off the Zoom here pretty quick because my kids are about to go to bed and I'm right down the hall, as always. I'll stick around on this for maybe, let's say, like, probably, since people tend to kick off pretty quickly. I'm just gonna stay on. I'm gonna shut down the audio and video, but I'll stay on chat for 5-10 minutes, or until everybody's gone. All right. So we'll talk to you next week. Like I said, probably no later than Monday. You should have the exam scores in one form or another, whether they're posted or sent to you guys. All right. Take care. Have a good night.
Thank you.
No problem. Take care.